Imagine holding a memory in your hands for the very first time. Before the middle of the 19th century, if you wanted to see the face of a loved one who had passed away or catch a glimpse of a far-off city across the ocean, you had to rely on a painting, a charcoal sketch, or a verbal description. But those were always interpretations, filtered through the specific eyes, the personal biases, and the technical skill of an artist. For most of human history, once a moment was gone, it was truly gone, fading into the hazy recesses of the mind where details are lost to time. The world was a place of disappearing sights and fleeting expressions, and the only way to preserve them was through the fragile and unreliable medium of the human mind. Then came a breakthrough that promised something that sounded like sorcery to the people of the time. It promised to freeze time itself and trap a reflection on a physical surface. It started as a miracle reserved for the elite, a complex dance of dangerous chemicals and heavy machinery that required the patience of a saint and the budget of a king. But the real story of photography is not just about the chemistry of light or the physics of lenses. It is a story about how a high-stakes professional craft was stripped down, simplified, and turned into a global supply chain that eventually put a camera into the hands of every person on the street. In those early days, if you wanted to take a picture, you were essentially a traveling laboratory technician. You could not simply walk outside and capture a view. The most famous early method, known as the Daguerreotype, was a marvel of the 1830s, but it was incredibly difficult and labor-intensive to produce. You started with a sheet of copper that had been plated with a thin layer of silver. You had to polish that plate until it shone like a perfect mirror, a process that could take hours of back-breaking labor and required the use of fine powders and steady hands. Even a single smudge or a speck of dust could ruin the entire effort. Once the surface was pristine, you had to sensitize it using the fumes from iodine, creating a chemical surface that would react when exposed to light. This had to be done in near darkness, turning the photographer into a shadow dweller. The most harrowing part of the entire ordeal came after the exposure had been made. To bring the hidden image out of the metal and make it visible to the human eye, you had to suspend the plate over a bath of heated mercury. The vapors were incredibly toxic, and the process was so delicate that even a tiny mistake in temperature or timing could ruin the entire image. Because there was no negative involved in this process, every daguerreotype was a one-of-a-kind object, a unique piece of silvered copper that could never be perfectly replicated. If you wanted a second copy for a relative or a friend, you had to sit perfectly still for the camera all over again, enduring the long exposure times and the bright glare of the sun. This was the great bottleneck of early visual media. It was slow, it was physically dangerous, and it was deeply rooted in the world of heavy metals and artisanal craftsmanship. As the years went on, the technology shifted away from metal plates and toward the use of glass. This was a significant step forward because it allowed for the creation of negatives. Now, once you had captured one good image on a glass plate, you could use light to print it onto sensitized paper dozens or even hundreds of times. But the glass era brought its own set of problems and frustrations. The most popular method for a long time was the wet plate process, which required the photographer to be a master of timing and logistics. A photographer had to coat a glass pane with a sticky, flammable chemical called collodion, dip it in a bath of silver nitrate, and then rush to take the photo while the plate was still wet. If the chemicals dried before the exposure was finished or before the plate could be developed, the image would be lost and the plate would be useless. This meant that if you wanted to take a photo of a distant mountain, a vast forest, or a chaotic battlefield, you had to drag a portable darkroom with you. You had to carry a heavy tripod, crates of fragile and heavy glass, and gallons of liquid chemicals into the wild. It was a logistical nightmare that kept photography firmly in the hands of professionals and the most dedicated, wealthy hobbyists who could afford to haul an entire laboratory into the field. The turning point came when people began to ask if they could get rid of the glass and the messy liquids entirely. The goal was to find a material that was dry, lightweight, and flexible, something that could hold the light-sensitive chemicals without breaking like glass or drying out like the wet plates. This is where the shift in the supply chain began to change the world. In the late 1800s, a young bank clerk named George Eastman became obsessed with simplifying this complicated mess. He hated the heavy glass plates and the specialized arcane knowledge required to use them. He began experimenting in his own kitchen, looking for a way to coat paper with a dry gelatin emulsion that could be used at any time and stored for long periods. This was the birth of the roll film. Instead of a single, fragile sheet of glass that had to be handled with extreme care, you now had a long strip of paper or a new synthetic material that could be wound onto a spool. This change allowed multiple photos to be taken in quick succession, without the need to swap out plates or retreat to a darkroom after every single click of the shutter. But inventing the film itself was only half the battle. To truly change history and the way humanity viewed itself, you had to invent an entire system. In 1888, the first truly consumer-grade camera was released to the public. It was a simple wooden box, unremarkable to look at, but it represented a radical and disruptive new business model. The promise made to the public was simple and enticing. It suggested that the customer should focus only on pressing the button, while the company handled everything else. Before this, the photographer had to be the manufacturer, the technician, and the chemist all at once. Now, the roles were split apart. The customer just had to point the box and click a shutter. They did not need to know about silver nitrate or mercury vapors or the physics of light. When the roll of film was finished, they did not head into a dark room to mix chemicals. They simply mailed the entire camera back to a factory. At that factory, a massive and organized industrial operation took over. Teams of workers would unload the cameras, develop the film in huge, standardized batches, print the photos onto paper, and then reload the camera with a fresh roll of film before mailing it back to the customer. This was the birth of the modern media supply chain. It turned photography from a specialized artisanal service into a recurring subscription. By standardizing the film and the developing process, the cost of creating an image plummeted. It was no longer about the value of a single precious silver plate. It was about the volume of the production. The more film people used, the cheaper the chemicals in the paper became, and the more the technology spread across the globe. This shift created an entirely new kind of visual culture that the world had never seen. For the first time in history, ordinary people began to take snapshots of their daily lives. They did not wait for a formal occasion or a trip to a professional studio. They took photos of their children playing in the dirt, their dogs lounging in the yard, and the messy, unvarnished reality of their own homes. History was no longer just the grand, polished story of presidents, kings, and generals, captured in stiff, formal, and carefully orchestrated poses. It became the story of everyone. This explosion of imagery had massive ripple effects across every level of society. It changed how news was reported, as cameras could now go where illustrators could not. It changed how products were sold through the power of visual advertising, and it changed how people understood the world beyond their own immediate neighborhoods. But this revolution also created a massive, insatiable demand for new materials. To keep up with the millions of rolls of film being produced and consumed, the industry needed vast, reliable amounts of silver, gelatin, and eventually a clear, flexible base that would not tear or degrade under the heat of a projector. That search for the perfect base material led the industry toward the world of early plastics. They needed something that possessed the clarity of glass, but the flexibility and durability of paper. They eventually found it in celluloid, a material that had been developed decades earlier as a substitute for the expensive and increasingly rare ivory used in billiard balls. By repurposing this material for the needs of film, the industry was able to create long, continuous strips that could move quickly through a camera or a projector. This did not just revolutionize still photography for the masses, It laid the essential foundation for the entire motion picture industry. Without the established supply chain of flexible roll film, the cinema would have been a physical impossibility. The ability to manufacture miles of consistent, high-quality film stock every single day was the secret engine behind the rise of Hollywood and the global film culture that dominated the 20th century.
Today, we carry cameras in our pockets that are millions of times more powerful than those original wooden boxes. We take more photos in a single day than the entire 19th century produced in several decades. We rarely think about the complex supply chain of silver or the logistics of mailing a wooden box to a factory, because our images are now made of digital data and light. But the core idea that George Eastman remains the same. The real breakthrough was not just the scientific ability to capture light on a surface. It was the ability to make that capture effortless for the average person. By moving the complexity away from the user and hiding it within a back-end system of mass manufacturing and industrial processing, we open the door for a truly visual world. The transition from a silver mirror with a memory to a flexible roll of film changed our fundamental relationship with time and truth. It made the image a universal language, one that was accessible to anyone, regardless of their level of training or their personal wealth. We are the direct heirs to that massive shift, living in a world that is defined by the ease of capturing any given moment. But as the 19th century came to a close, the search for new and more versatile materials was only beginning to pick up speed. The overwhelming success of those early flexible films proved that synthetic materials could do things that natural ones never could, sparking an intense race to find the next great substance that could be molded, shaped, and perfected by human hands. That momentum carried the world of chemistry into a new era, where we stopped trying to simply imitate nature and started trying to outdo it. The same drive for efficiency, durability, and mass production that made the camera a common household object soon turned its attention toward the very building blocks of the physical world. In the next chapter of our timeline, we will see how a search for a better coating for wood led to an accidental but monumental discovery in 1907. This next breakthrough would change the stakes entirely, moving us from the age of film and into the age of plastics with the arrival of Bakelite. If you found this journey through the history of the image and the materials that made it possible interesting, make sure to stay tuned as we explore how these material revolutions continued to